Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dia Online. My name is Matilde Guidelli. I am Dia's associate curator and very excited to introduce today's event, a conversation on Carla Lonzi's self-portrait. And I would encourage my fellow panelists to turn on their cameras with artists and scholars Claire Fontaine, Jaleh Mansoor, and Giovanna Zapperi joining us from Palermo, Vancouver, and Geneva, respectively. The occasion to gather today around Carla Lonzi is the release of the first English translation of her radical book of art criticism, Autoritratto, originally published in 1969, that was translated by Allison Grimaldi Donahue and published by Divided in collaboration with Dia. Little known in English scholarship, Carla Lonzi was an important art critic and feminist theorist operating in a period of political and social transformation in Italy and elsewhere, spanning the 60s and 70s. And in Lonzi's trajectory, self-portrait constitutes a liminal book that at once unsettled and reimagined the form and value of art criticism, and also marked a shift in emphasis in her life from art writing to feminist theory and practice. So my warmest welcome and gratitude to Claire Fontaine, Jaleh, and Giovanna. You have done so much to think through the legacy of Lonzi in your writing and art, and we are very lucky to have you here. And thanks to Dia colleagues, Camila, Michelle, Theodora, and Max. Thanks to Eleanor and Camilla at Divided. Congratulations again to Alison Katz and Allison Grimaldi Donahue, who designed and translated this wonderful English edition of Self-Portrait. So a little bit about the run of today's event. Our panelists will present topics and problems for collective discussion, and we will leave time for what we hope will be a lively Q&A at the end. So you are welcome to drop questions in the Q&A function as we go, and you can activate closed captions by clicking on the menu at the bottom of the screen. And now, virtual applause. And I pass it on to Giovanna, who will start us off.
Thank you, Matilde. Thank you, the Art Foundation, for inviting me to participate in this conversation. So I would like to start my brief presentation today by stressing the significance of self-portrait, Autoritratto, for our understanding of the art of the period. In her reading of the 1960s Italian art scene, Lonzi leaves aside the linear model based on the art historical fiction of the artistic renewal and replacement of one movement after the other, which was dominant at the time, and rather proposes a radically different epistemic structure. Instead of promoting a group or a movement, Lonzi has cultivated non-hierarchical relations involving artists associated with different groups or generations. While contesting the verticality of male genealogies, Lonzi has fostered a horizontal model that left behind the admiration for the great artist and focused instead on the relations, experiences, and life forms that emerged in the art of her time. In spite of the formal heterogeneity of the practices she was interested in, she proposed a form of intergenerational dialogue that challenged the avant-gardistic logic of formal innovation and rupture. During the 1960s, Carla Lonzi tried to develop her own practice as an art critic, which culminated in the book Autoritratto, Self-Portrait. The book is based on her self-positioning as a subject and on a sharp critique of the social and epistemic structures defining the critic's activity. Autoritratto is based on conversations that Lonzi recorded, transcribed, and assembled between 1965 and 1969. Each dialogue is fragmented and edited in a way that preserves the colloquial quality of spoken language. By constructing the fiction of an uninterrupted conversation, Lonzi ceases to ask questions or discuss the artist's work. She rather speaks for herself in her own voice. In other words, with this book, she wanted to challenge art criticism as an activity based on an authoritarian posture, the aesthetic judgment, while at the same time she tried to rethink art itself outside of the ideological framework that defined it. Lonzi's undoing of the conventions of art criticism was an attempt to experiment a different relation with artists, one that was based on mutual recognition and avoided established hierarchies. So with Autoritratto, that she published in 1969, and now we are seeing on the screen some pages from the first edition, this 1969 edition that she assembled at that time. So with this book, she was looking for a way to escape what she called the inauthentic profession of art criticism in favor of a participatory process that could be personally transformative. Accordingly, the conversations unsystematically address each artist's work and career, but also aspects of their lives and relationships, their shared frustration with Italian art institutions, as well as a number of reflections on the current political situation. These range from discussions of the 1968 protest, the civil rights movement in the United States, the Vietnam War, and the emergence of a feminist consciousness, especially in the dialogues with Carla Cardi. Lonzi had also requested that the artist send her pictures so that the ongoing conversation is punctuated with a number of illustrations, thus simulating the traditional text-image format of art history books, as you can see in the images. However, the majority of these images are personal or travel snapshots, and consequently, their presence throughout the book provides a biographical element within the conversations that comprise the text. These photographs that are interspersed throughout the book convey the entwinement of art and life that was crucial to Lonzi's critical project, while at the same time echoing the non-linear temporality structuring the book. So Lonzi quite literally undoes both the practices and the poetics of dominant forms of art writing, abandoning the authority of interpretation in order to participate in the creative process. Her focus on the artist's subjectivity and non-hierarchical exchanges undermines the primacy of the visual, of the artwork, as one of formalism epistemic foundations. And of course, formalism was the main available language for a criticism in the 1960s. Lonzi's undoing of art history's epistemic structures emerged from a cluster of issues addressed throughout the book. The dispersed, heterogeneous, and collective subjectivity that challenges established notions of the author, the adoption of a non-linear temporality created through editing and montage, and her rejection of formalism with its privileging of vision. What is perhaps even more striking is the way these counter-discourses emerge from the actual construction of the book, which performs a deconstruction of canonical narratives, thereby encouraging alternative forms of knowledge production. For Lonzi, who was interested in connecting her activity to the facts of life, the need to rethink arts institutions went hand in hand with the reconsideration of her own role. As she writes in the book's preface, her intention in assembling the book was not so much to collect information, but rather, quote, to interact with someone in a broadly communicative and humanly satisfying way, unquote, introducing herself into, quote, an activity and a humanity to which I felt attracted, but which did not belong to me, unquote. Consequently, the assemblage-like construction of the book enacts a complex process of becoming a subject in the male-dominated art world of 1960s Italy, in which the roles and identifications that sustain it collapse altogether. What remains is a sort of relational space that is the precondition for a possible liberation from the myths that constitute what we call art. What remains, she writes, now that I have lost the role of art critic? Have I perhaps become an artist? My reply is that I am no longer an outsider, end quote. Lonzi's assemblage of the book embodies the search for an outlet that rejects the critic's coherence and unity by dispersing her own voice within a nonlinear, dialogic, and collective narrative. Within these terms, the book resonates with her feminist writings, where issues of subjectivity, participation, and self-representation are crucial. So Autoritratto is not a feminist publication, even though it was assembled shortly before Lonzi's decision to opt out her abandonment of art criticism. And actually, all the artists in the books are male, except for Carla Cardi. Its topicality for feminist thinking resides, in my opinion, in its method and epistemic structure. The book breaks away with the notion of the creative act as a solitary gesture, allowing for a rethinking of the artist's subjectivity in opposition to the notion of the autonomous and coherent individual. Autoritratto strongly resonates with 1968 transformative potential, which required new strategies in the field of art and culture. Lonzi's critical project foregrounds the possibility to experiment new forms of being together that were incompatible with the kind of discourse advocated by other critics of the time, such as, for example, Germano Celant and others. In conclusion, with Autoritratto, Self-Portrait, Lonzi proposed a radical alternative to the hegemonic, linear, and historical construction that we still suffer the consequences and that we have not yet left behind. Her unsystematic attempt to develop a different epistemic framework can perhaps contribute to an alternative genealogy of knowledge production in Italy and beyond, one that we need today to redefine our own practices as art historians, critics, and curators. Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanna. We'll hear now from Claire Fontaine.
Thank you, Matilde, for this beautiful invitation. I'm very, very happy to be here with Giovanna and Jaleh, although in a virtual way, because they are dear friends and important interlocutor, and we had wonderful conversations talking about this day. So thank you for creating this space for us. I have decided to tackle the refusal to work in Lonzi, her refusal of professional life that played an important role in the disagreements that she had with her close friend and comrade Carla Cardi and with her long-term companion Pietro Consagra. Disagreement that led to the end of the relationships in both cases. So I would like to approach Self-Portrait as a pivotal book, a book of the irreversible refusal. In our foreword, we have compared it to Now You Can Go by Pure, which is the book recounting the end of a long love relationship, because Self-Portrait also marks the end of a romance, the one with the idea of art criticism that was based on the intuition that Carla Lonzi had early on in her life that, I quote her, extraordinary things were possible between beings. It was a promise that art criticism didn't keep, because for Lonzi, this discipline turned out to be a judgmental and pedantic activity that ultimately ended up replacing rather than eviscerating the expressions of the artists. Retracing her journey towards feminism, she wrote in Self-Portrait, I quote her again, "I began to look for it, being certain that it was expressed somewhere, that it would be manifested somewhere, a potentiality that I felt humanity possessed. I knew I had it, and that I felt that it belonged to everyone," end of the quote. Although she became afraid of getting stranded on the border of this promised land, Lonzi pursued this existential feeling, like she called it, but she realized that she wouldn't find it in a professional context. And for this, she had to make feminism, as she said. because the practice with women was transformative, as Giovanna noticed, and it wasn't a form of liberation, but it was already a practice of freedom. There were immediate existential and political possibilities of forming relationships in which women could express themselves, not only in the few spaces that were allocated by men to them for this purpose, the making of art or the creation of cultural products, but with their entire life. Lonzi is very critical of women who seek professional recognition within society, giving up the need to completely transform it, just bringing feminist contents to the world of culture. In one of her diary's entries, Lonzi wrote the following, I quote her, "The person she was before couldn't have helped me, but in the group that I formed, she found a way of becoming herself and of pushing me to do the same. So I've come to understand why I had to make feminism, in order to make Sarah exist so that she could make me exist." End of the quote. Feminism was a space where people could transform themselves and others by concentrating on how they saw each other, outside of the influence of any other value system, outside of the complementarity with or the imitation of men. Lonzi radically refused the segmentation and the compartmentalization of different parts of life because she saw how insidious this was for women, how unsustainable were the double militancy, the professional work and the work of care. She resolutely stood against the blackmail of multitasking. For me, doing one thing is a way of not doing two, she said. She was entirely absorbed by the pursuit of freedom, but far from being a selfish and socially privileged goal, was the way of creating emancipatory relationship that couldn't be born outside of feminist contexts, a way of inflecting subjectivization, definitely more powerful than art or art criticism. This plan of political radicality is still a horizon of hope nowadays, that politics have become a space of scandal and regret. They become the context of inevitable corruption or repression. The importance of Lonzi's position lays precisely in a resolute indifference to what is commonly considered as privilege, in fact. If in order to be included in something, her research of freedom and the making of feminism were threatened, then it was better to remain illegible, unrecognized and misunderstood by the largest part of people. Any social or professional recognition appear as derisory in light of the possibility of resonating with other women's subjectivities on a deeper level. In a text from 1972 entitled "The Meaning of Consciousness Raising Within Feminist Groups," Carla Lonzi stated that through consciousness raising, women gained a historical, psychological, and mental space where they no longer needed men's approval. Maria Luisa Boccia, who is a very important critic of Lonzi, wrote about this conception of consciousness raising, that what was truly revolutionary in it was that consciousness raising was a real gesture of attribution of value to the feminine experience as such. I quote her, "Without having to define what needs to be preserved and what should be discarded in the feminine or masculine universe, the practice of consciousness raising showed to every woman the possibility of looking at herself and at her own life as to a resource of knowledge and autonomy." End of the quote. The unexpected subject is the one that, ignoring what is said to be good for her, finds it by trusting only her own pleasure, her own feelings, her own judgment, without calculating the consequences that this will have in her personal or professional life. Women's gesture, Carla Lonzi wrote in another entry of her diary, are bound not to become a product, precisely because their value comes from relationships and people. They are gestures made in the air, like the ones of acrobats, gestures made of air. On these gestures, without an outcome, we build our lives. These are the gestures that men appropriate as the meaning providers so that they can say that the material of our lives belongs to them. End of the quote. I just think that in order to understand why Carla Lonzi left the art world and dedicated all her energy to the adventure of feminism, we need to also understand the scope of this revolution of values that wasn't only imagined, but that actually happened, so that the feminist gestures made of air have now transformed the world irreversibly. And that today, thank you.
Thank you so much. And now I'm going to share my screen again, and we will hear from Jaleh.
Hi. So firstly, I need to acknowledge that I'm currently speaking on the unceded ancestral lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples in what is known as Vancouver, Canada. And this is the condition for the possibility of everything that I could be thinking and saying right now. And I'd very much like to thank Matilde for this generous invitation. And I'd like to thank Giovanna and Claire Fontaine for their sustaining friendship and their unbelievable scholarship on the figure of Carla Lonzi, who I think, as we look back on the 20th century, should and will be a very important and notable figure. So to answer Lonzi's own question of herself, have I become an artist? To answer that in a way that I think informs the specificity of her feminism and her elaboration of a creative, collective feminist subject, to answer her question, I would say yes. And I'm interested in my work right now in Autoritratto as a piece, as a kind of artwork in its own stance that hybridizes documentary and fiction in a way that I think is very important for Lonzi's feminism later. So Lonzi takes 4 years of conversation with 14 artists. This is recorded on audio tape and then transcribed. She then takes this, scrambles it, and reassembles it into this extraordinary long montage in a book form that then goes under the cover of a self-portrait, which I find utterly fascinating in how she's dismantling and reassembling a model of subjectivity. So I'm interested in how she unworks this genre of self-portraiture by replacing self-reflection, expression, interiority with the understanding that a self is constituted through an external field of social relations, material and social relations. And this turning of things inside out is where I think the crux of the project is, that then enables her elaboration of a very special kind of feminist praxis. But to get there, I want to point out the way in which she turns things inside out across her work. And I'm interested in her privileged term, authenticity, that Giovanna also brought up, and that Giovanna's work has meticulously traced to Lonzi's early readings of French existentialism and of Theodore Adorno's Minima Moralia. Really interesting influence. I think that Adorno's influence stayed with Lonzi, or rather, she shared a great deal with his position insofar as up to the point that she exits the art world and thinking about art as a full-time position, she insists on the opacity of the artwork in the last instance, that it should never be a form of propaganda, and that it is political when it is least political. And so she didn't like activism. You know, she's pretty harshly critical of the protesters at the Milan Triennial of 1968, and then, you know, the famous protests at the Venice Biennale of 1968. And this, you know, it kind of, in a strange way, augurs Adorno's own, you know, his death precipitated by the feminist activists in his 1969 lecture, you know, now known as the Busen Action, where 3 sociology students took the podium by storm and, you know, tried to sort of embrace Adorno as an actual human being, and he couldn't take it. So that's interesting. And also that the next year she goes through her own exit to then become a full-time feminist activist with the inauguration of Rivolta Femminile and this kind of plastering the walls or the streets of the city with visual material to sort of attract other women into Rivolta Femminile. So this other kind of way of turning things inside out. And it's the way that she gets there that's fascinating. So I think in answer to her question, she's doing something that seems to me very much tracking parallel with the artists that she liked best. So Luciano Fabro or Giulio Paolini, or even to some extent Lucio Fontana, whom she collected, all of whom summon the outside. You know, and I'm sort of floating this idea of the thought of the outside from Blanchot and others, you know, where these artists took the material constraints of the outside. So for Paolini, the frame, and, you know, sort of showing the back of the canvas and then the materials that constitute the condition for the possibility of the work. I think that this is how Lonzi arrived at both authenticity and a collective feminist subject by turning all of these social relations inside out and, you know, recognizing that it's the material and social constraints of a really unbearable social field, outside world, that one has to fully acknowledge, internalize, and then carve out from within to try and map this other path of a collective feminist subject that could be born of creative exploration and experimentation without entering into this kind of mimetic inscription of heavily ideological forms of protest and activism, which were the kinds of protests and activist gestures that she disliked so much earlier in the 60s. So yeah, I'm just interested in answering her own question of herself and thinking about how her exiting criticism, entering the space of becoming an artist, then enables this peculiarly energetic, dynamic form of feminism, which is where she seems to have finally found some kind of satisfying model of authenticity. So thank you very much.
So thank you all very much for these thoughts and preliminary topics for our conversation. And I think we can all come back to the screen now. So I think perhaps you all, something that was common in all of your presentation, and perhaps as a first point to start our conversation, I would like to think a little longer about Lonzi as writer and Autoritratto as object. And Giovanna, in your writing, you eloquently described Lonzi's work as experiments in ways of writing differently, where writing literally wears out or undoes the disciplinary languages of art criticism and philosophy. And here, as you all eloquently, especially Giovanna and Jaleh, described, Lonzi literally does that via montage. So the interview replaces the specialized language with dialogical utterances, and the indexical record of the artist's voice on the magnetic tape generates this kind of expectation of authenticity, where the authoriality of the artist supposedly remains unaltered, but in fact, it is a highly mediated book, as you explained, where authoriality is dispersed and transformed by Lonzi's textual and visual montage. And so I would like to see whether we could comment and think about Lonzi's writing differently as an experimental strategy in relation to power, and one that at once, as you described, beautifully dismantles and builds anew in the present tense of writing, so that this kind of like personal exercise as well as of internal transformation. And most interesting perhaps to our time today as well, which implication does a work like Autoritratto bear on traditional systems of meaning and value creation in the system that today we call the art industry? So this is for all of you to think through if you have comments or thoughts.
Thank you, Matilde, for these remarks. Maybe I just start because you were mentioning this idea of writing differently. I don't know if I mentioned that today, but it must be somewhere in one of my texts on Lonzi. I think that this idea of writing differently has to do precisely with what you have just said, the fact that she was experimenting something different from the canonical ways of producing knowledge on art and the canonical ways of looking at artworks and of thinking about art, and especially this, the primacy of the vision, because there's no commentary in Autoritratto. Maybe I should underline this point further. Autoritratto is not a book where an art critic discusses artworks or even looks at artworks. She rather discusses with artists about why they are doing things and how they are doing things, but she leaves the space, for their own narrative, let's put it this way. So this was for me a very important point, that she is withdrawing from a position of exteriority, which is mediated by vision, as the dominant way of accessing art, but also as the dominant way of producing knowledge, to perform this distance from the subject to the object of knowledge. And when I was thinking and when I was suggesting this idea of writing differently, I was really thinking about the fact that she's experimenting, as you said, which also means that she's not necessarily knowing where this is leading her. She's experimenting, as said, that she's trying to, on one side, to think about art from this other, like, dialogical, relational art perspective, but also this writing differently has to do with her, how can I say, with something that has to do with the process, with something that is unfinished, and that will remain unfinished throughout Lonzi's trajectory. Which has to do with her, what I call her process of disidentification, that she withdraws from not only from the structures of knowledge production, but also from her identification with the role of our critic, and the kind of activity and acts that an art critic is supposed to perform, and her position as an art critic with respect to the artist, etc. And this first step, let's say, in a process of withdrawing from established roles will become crucial throughout the years, when she's thinking of the subject position as woman, woman as an already available construct or product or subject position. And this notion of authenticity that you brought in the discussion has to do with this unfinished process of undoing oneself as as attributed to the role of woman, to the place of woman. I don't know if that's clear, but maybe Fulvia or Jaleh would like to develop further.
Yeah, I just want to build on your pointing out that she's working from the outside in. And I noted in your work that you point out at one point that she refers to women as ready-made, which is quite a radical thing to say in 1969, 1970. And it's the way that she works from the outside in by reworking the medium that she's working in, writing itself, that I think is really extraordinary. And it might be useful to compare her position to the kind of experimental creative writing that would happen a little bit right around the bend in the context of French feminism. So say Hélène Cixous's Laugh of the Medusa, published in 1975, there Cixous is calling on women to write themselves, but she's also mobilizing a kind of format that we're all pretty used to, the manifesto, from this kind of avant-garde manifesto format. So it's really Lonzi's retooling of media itself that I think is part of her project in a really interesting way that ends up being political. So I think one thing she does is cross the boundary between formalism and social consciousness. And I love that. I defer to Fulvia.
Yes, I don't know how much I have to offer in terms of a critical perspective applied on Lonzi's use of language and her use of knowledge, philosophy, politics in general. Everything for her needed to have a use value. There is a real passion for immanence. There is a constant production of intensity and a constant production of the present in her writings that I think is still working today. And of course, Allison, who's here with us, I guess, must have suffered while translating her, because she really does bend Italian language, and the Italian language is very bendable, but there is also a form of disobedience, a form of freedom that she takes in using this language. And I wouldn't compare her with Cixous, and I wouldn't compare her actually with anyone else if other people were using recorded language at the same time in Italy, but it was a laborious process, because the technology was not portable, and it was a real commitment to record, transcribe, and all of this. But I think there is a real materiality of language that she says in Self-Portrait she's passionate about, and she wants to transfer from the air, this air that she says women are made of somehow symbolically, and transvaluate it by putting it on paper. But it's a writing on paper that disavows somehow all the other writings or the other books. It's really explosive because it's really unaffiliated. It's really straight to the point. It's not respectful. So it's not that I do not want to historicize Lonzi. I think the political context that she was part of and that she created is absolutely essential for her interpretation. Don't get me wrong, but I do think that there is actually a very interesting attitude in a relationship to history and to the official narratives. and to the use of the official language of criticism that is, as I was saying, very irreverent. So she actually does invite everyone to historicize women's many, many times in her writings, but she doesn't trust the existing narratives, as I think she harbors the same skepticism towards art historical narratives, because she does not express, as Giovanna said, any feminist, specifically feminist choice when she puts together these friends that were the friends that she had, but most definitely she had doubts about the way art history was constructed and the authority was distributed and attributed to artists. And she's not mysterious when she talks about how men in the cultural proposal, how culture is the culture of men at that point, and I think she is not exaggerating.
I don't know, maybe there are questions from, how should we?
So I have actually another question that may, before turning to the audience, that somehow addresses some of the threads that you brought up today, both the question of the horizon of freedom that you spoke about, Claire Fontaine, as well as the question of Lonzi's legacy that we were just discussing. And there's a beautiful turn of phrase that you use, Claire Fontaine, in an essay describing Lonzi's legacy as being as precious as it is problematic, and going on to describe a vivid image that brings us to questions about legacy, but also tools and process. And Lonzi's process in your essay is analog to the Baron of Munchausen escaping quicksand by pulling himself out by his own hair, which it's such an incredible image. And I would like to see if you have comments around this kind of almost like couple of terms, precious and problematic, the acrobatics of Munchausen, and then another image that comes to mind is your own work in which you actually engage with Lonzi with floor-bound sculptures that are covered, essentially bricks covered by book covers of Lonzi's Rivolta Femminile books, which have this beautiful, clean, mint green cover that kind of is actually echoed in the translation of the new book. So yes, a question around the legacy of Lonzi being as precious and problematic, tools, as well as how in your writing, but for all of you, Lonzi comes to perhaps be an example of what you theorize as human strike.
Yes, most definitely. Human strike owes a lot to feminism in general, Italian feminism, the revolutionary part of it, that also owes to other feminist thinkers. I mean, the legacies are connected, and there is a specific flavor to the Italian feminism that we love and we always bring up in our texts and often in our work. But yes, human strike, to begin with the end of your question, is a strike that takes place on an existential level, that is the inflection of a subjectivity in a direction that can increase their power, so that avoids the dynamic of domination, that extracts them from dynamics of subjection, and also creates a situation of non-definition, of relative illegibility, which is this category of Lonzi that I have also tried to work on. And I must say, it's painful to work on Lonzi. We were talking about this with Giovanna, because it always moves deeply, not only emotional, but how would I say, like it does question the approach that we have, the theoretical approach that we have to our objects of work, because it does invite us to reflect on the way we are giving value, giving authority to things, to references, which processes we are going for materially, symbolically, how we are, evaluating the decisions that we are making on the basis of a set of values that is always there. So I would say that she has, yes, made feminism out of nothing, not because there weren't other feminist thinkers around, or although she has a specific singularity, of course, but because these kind of revolts that were taking place after 68, and she contextualizes, of course, all of this in Let's Spit on Hegel in particular, they were generic revolts, they were human strikes. They weren't corporate revolts. They were moving away from the blind spots of Marxism to get to the places that weren't only related to production and to the professional identification with one's life. So definitely there was this refusal to work that didn't only exist within feminists. I briefly mentioned the conflict by subtraction that also existed in Italy. Women were leaving their jobs because they were finding that they weren't emancipating them. It was a gesture of, they called it conflict by subtraction because they didn't want to have a conversation about it. They just left. So these are definitely all movements that have a lot to do with the idea of human strike, because they are movements of the subjectivities to acquire more freedom and more potentiality and to transform themselves. And they are not related as much to the process of production as they are related to the process of reproduction, also reproduction of the self in the broad sense, not only biological reproduction. So I don't want to take too much space. I want to hear my friends too, but just to say I haven't answered so much about the work, but I think these questions are useful maybe for the audience to put it into context, because Lonzi hasn't been so available, and the 70s in Italy are mythologized, and I don't know what is the set of references that we all have in common. So I just would like to pass to the others.
Yes, maybe I can jump in, starting from what Fulvia has just discussed, this question of the strike, which for me has to do with both this question of authenticity that we discussed earlier, but also with Lonzi's practice of withdrawal from the roles that constitutes one's own social relations. And I was thinking, Jaleh, you mentioned possible connections with French feminism, and I was thinking more than Sixus of someone like Monique Wittig in her famous text, I forgot the title, but it's in the Straight Mind collection, where she famously claims that lesbians are not women, so that she performs this idea of radical disidentification from women as something that what's the meaning of women. And I think there is something similar that Lonzi does in her own practice, of course, through the group in Rivolta Femminile and with the practice of autocoscienza, but also when she theorizes, when she imagines this figure that she calls the clitoral woman. There's this idea of the vaginal woman and the clitoral woman. And the clitoral woman, again, is another political fiction in a way. It's not a real, person or a real subject, but it's a way to imagine a possible subject position that is precisely based on, what Fulvia called the human strike, or the radical refusal of the gestures and acts and behaviors and relations that situate us in social relations and in gender relations. This is also why, when I was thinking of when we were discussing, also Jaleh, you were mentioning this idea of a woman as a ready-made. There is this kind of stereotyped vision of early 1970s Italian feminism as fundamentally essentialist, and we're really far. I mean, it's a different way of putting this question from today's feminist discussions, but I think we are really far from it. We only think that we can only think that Lonzis feminism is essentialist if we take if we take this idea of notion of the clitoral woman or vaginal woman as a real embodiment, whereas she really conceived of those figures as fictions, as way of thinking of possible processes of liberation. And whereas she considers the term woman, as said, as something that is already available, that we need to deconstruct and to undo in our own practice. And of course, it's a process that is by definition unfinished, because woman is what constitutes us as subjects. So maybe I'll leave it here.
Jaleh, do you want to jump in?
No, I'm curious. I'm curious to hear what the audience might be thinking.
Yes, I have a question, comment from Raffaele Bedarida. Raffaele asks, starting in the 1960s in the social sciences, oral historians have emphasized nonlinearity, shared authority, intersubjectivity, self-reflection of oral sources as critical tools in such a way that has little parallels in art history and art criticism. I wonder if Lonzi, Raffaele asks, was aware of or interested in the emergence of oral history.
Maybe I can try and answer this. Carla Lonzi, in the 1960s, she was a regular contributor to a journal called Marca Tre. It was a journal published in Genova, directed by Eugenio Battisti, who was a very important and very interesting art historian at that time. And Marca Tre was a transdisciplinary journal. And this is where she published her first conversations with artists. She started to publish, she had a series called Discorses in Marca Tre. And there she published her conversation with Fabro, I believe, up until the conversation with Pino Pascali, where she raised her questions. So you have practically the page with dots, and then Pascali speculating on a question that we are not able to hear, to read. Sorry. And why I'm mentioning Marca Tre, because this is a journal where you had many. Not only art critic, it was not a specifically art journal, it was a transdisciplinary journal where you have texts from architects, cultural producers, many important or famous people like Umberto Eco wrote there, etc. And this is where you had also a number of researchers working in the field of anthropology and folklore, which were also experimenting with oral history, with kind of research, conversations and oral. I wouldn't say oral history, but with inquiries based on conversations that were taped. So of course, her interest in tape recording conversations with artists has to do with this general frame in Italy. I hope that answers.
Okay, maybe we have this one last question. Telly Bick asks, Giovanna, I was struck by your comments regarding Lonzi's experimentation with new forms of being together in such a way that was incompatible with what other critics proposed at the time. I was wondering if you could say a bit more on that point Is there a theoretical model or framework outside of art criticism that might help elucidate the resonance of these forms? Was perhaps the revived legacy of Piero Gobetti and Carlo Rosselli in the new Italian left important to Lonzi, for example? Thank you.
I don't know. I don't think so. I have never encountered those names in Lonzi's text, but who knows? But again, I am a bit, how can I say? I'm a bit skeptical about this idea of that, you know, she's inspired by some male predecessors, for example, and also of, you know, constructing such a precise genealogy. I think she was operating in a context in which those practices were, you know, being experimented by a number of subjects, by activists also, by, you know, scholars, by writers possibly, and she was part of it. I don't think that there is, you know, a vertical relation. I think it was more like a general, how can I say, atmosphere and milieu that, you know, in which she was enmeshed. So yeah, the precise names, I don't know. I mean, she was, the names that she's referring the most is, of course, Roberto Longhi. She was a student of art historian and critic Roberto Longhi, and of course, Carlo Giulio Argano, who was the other, you know, important figure in the field of art criticism and art history. And she's contesting both in different way, more frontally in the case of Argan, and also because Argan was so much connected with the Italian Communist Party, which had a hegemonic, how can I say, a hegemonic role in the field of culture. And she had herself been part of the Italian Communist Party in the early 50s, like every intellectual in Italy at that time, but she had withdrawn from the PC, and I believe in 1956 already, after Hungary. And so she was very suspicious towards the left, or in any case, towards leftist groups and leftist intellectuals, or self-identified leftist intellectuals.
So we're coming to an end, and I would like to ask all of you if you have final comments or thoughts before thanking you and our audience. Okay, so while you think, I want to encourage all of you to take advantage of this today's 40% discount on the purchase of the translation that you will find on the website, and also in the Q&A function you will see. And thank you, many thanks. And just for us all to think about for another conversation, there are a few questions around the relationship between Lonzi and other feminist critics that came of age around her time, but in the Anglo-Saxon. Unfortunately, we don't have time for that, but I thank you all so much, both the panelists and the audience, for your participation, and goodbye.